In the year 1515, deep within the stone belly of Nuremberg, a woman named Margaret Schmidt was dragged through the iron gates of a medieval dungeon. Her voice echoed down the corridors, defiant first, then frightened, then fading into the weight of the walls. Witnesses said she shouted that she would rather burn alive than face what waited for her below. 6 hours later, she was whispering, asking only that it end. What could possibly break a person so completely? It wasn't whips, fire, or the rack. What awaited her was a device that left no wound a surgeon could see. It was made not to destroy flesh, but to unmake certainty, to convince the prisoner that her own mind could no longer be trusted. The chamber that held it sat beneath the city courthouse, a place citizens passed daily without realizing that, below their feet, fear had been engineered into architecture. Candlelight never reached those corridors. The air was thick with lime dust and the smell of wet iron. In that darkness, justice was not measured in fairness but in confession. By the early 16th century, Europe's rulers had discovered that fear worked better than force. Pain stopped the heart too soon. Terror kept it beating. The body could resist, faint, or die, but the imagination had no limits. So inquisitors began to study it. They experimented with isolation, silence, anticipation, conditions that could trap a mind inside its own panic. Out of this search came a machine that history would later name the Iron Maiden. At first glance, it looked almost ceremonial. A tall metal cabinet shaped like a human form, its front carved into a frozen mask. When the heavy doors opened, the dim torchlight glinted on a pattern of short iron points, sharp enough to break skin but not deep enough to kill. According to the records left by Hans Schmidt, Nuremberg's executioner from 1501 to 1532, the placement of those points was deliberate. "They are arranged," he wrote, "that the condemned may breathe, though pierced." The genius, if that word can ever be used for cruelty, was that the pain never peaked. Each breath pressed the wounds a little deeper. Each heartbeat trembled against the metal, and the victim remained aware through every moment of it. But even this was only the beginning. The most important weapon was not iron, it was suggestion. Before the door closed, the inquisitor described what would happen, how the body would settle against the spikes, how movement would worsen it, how stillness might bring mercy. That picture planted itself in the prisoner's mind. The fear of what was coming did most of the work long before the door shut. Hans Schmidt's ledger mentions that most confessions came within an hour, not from agony, but from imagination. The prisoner believed that every motion was driving steel deeper into vital places. In truth, many of the points never reached more than a few millimeters beneath the skin. But the mind supplied what the metal did not. Margaret Schmidt lasted nearly 2 hours before she confessed to witchcraft and, under pressure, named 17 others. Her words were written into the record as evidence that evil walked among the townsfolk. In the logic of the time, terror justified itself. Yet, even as the confessions multiplied, the inquisitors wanted improvement. They believed mercy could be designed into cruelty. So, the next generation of craftsmen added 2 small holes where the eyes would be. It was a trivial modification with monstrous results. The prisoner inside could now see out. Through those tiny openings she could glimpse torchlight, silhouettes, and the movement of other captives being led toward their own questioning. The experience no longer belonged to darkness alone. It became partial light, visibility without agency. Modern psychologists call the response learned helplessness, when a person can see danger but cannot act to stop it. 16th century inquisitors didn't know the term, but they understood the outcome. Victims who had endured the Iron Maiden with viewing holes broke faster, often within minutes. They would confess, recant, accuse others, anything to end the unbearable awareness of being seen yet powerless. Church officials defended the alteration as compassionate. The condemned, they said, might reflect on their sins by observing the world they were leaving behind. In practice, it merely showed them what they could no longer touch. From Spain to the German states, versions of this improved maiden spread. A record from Toledo in 1487, recounted later in Vatican archives, describes Maria Gonzalez, accused of heresy. She was placed in the device at dawn. By midday, she had confessed to everything the inquisitor proposed, then began inventing more. When the door finally opened, she was barely conscious, murmuring apologies to names no one recognized. 5 centuries later, scholars would read that account and realize it documented not spiritual revelation but psychological collapse. Then came the next refinement, one that redefined what mercy meant in the language of the Church. Around 1523, under the sanction of Pope Adrian VI, the spikes were removed altogether. The new model, called the Maiden of Mercy, was a coffin of smooth iron, no puncture, no blood. The accused was sealed within total darkness, barely able to breathe. Officials claimed this silence would encourage repentance. "The sinner confronted by solitude," read one decree, "shall find confession through reflection, but the records of the monks who administered it tell a different story. Within hours, prisoners began to hallucinate. Some heard whispers in the blackness, others felt hands that were not there." Brother Francesco de Marco, a Franciscan chronicler, wrote of a man named Lorenzo Meducci, confined at sunrise and by nightfall reduced to speaking with the imagined voice of his dead mother. He confessed to witchcraft at dawn, though no evidence of heresy was ever found. One survivor wrote afterward that he begged to be returned to the spiked version. "The pain of metal," he said, "ends when blood runs. The darkness does not." To theologians, this seemed like triumph. A punishment without visible injury meant the soul alone was being purified. To historians today, it marked the birth of psychological torture, suffering that leaves the body intact but the mind dismantled. Yet the evolution did not stop there. Human cruelty, once justified as faith, tends to innovate. By the late 16th century, inquisitors in Nuremberg and Vienna began constructing entire chambers of illusion around the Iron Maiden. Instead of relying on real victims, they created the appearance of suffering. Archaeological reports from the late 20th century uncovered secret mechanisms inside these chambers: hidden bellows, echo tubes, and pulleys designed to simulate screams and the groan of bending metal. The walls were shaped to magnify sound until the air itself seemed alive with torment. A prisoner brought into such a room would hear what seemed to be another human trapped inside the maiden, pleading, choking, then falling silent. In reality, the sound came from gears and carved wooden resonators behind the walls. Even the scent of blood was imitated using animal fluids poured beneath the floor grates. The effect was devastating. The accused, convinced that someone else was dying nearby, confessed almost immediately. The Inquisition's internal records show confession rates above 90% in these so-called theaters of confession. Few questioned the authenticity of what they heard. Imagination filled in the rest. The goal had shifted from punishment to control. By proving that fear could create obedience without touch, the inquisitors achieved what earlier tortures never could: domination through belief. Some historians now argue that this was the real invention hidden behind the legend of the Iron Maiden. When the first physical Iron Maiden of Nuremberg appeared publicly in 1793, centuries later, it may have been modeled on stories of those sound chambers rather than an actual medieval device. The exhibit toured Europe as a curiosity, then a warning. Visitors stared at its steel spikes and felt the chill of imagined screams. The illusion continued, repackaged as history. But if the device itself was partly myth, the mindset behind it was not. Documents from inquisitorial courts show an unbroken line of reasoning, that truth could be extracted not through evidence, but through confession, and that confession could be manufactured through terror. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, some thinkers began to recoil from these methods. Philosophers such as Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire questioned whether a justice system built on fear could ever claim moral authority. Still, even as physical torture waned, the psychological legacy endured. In the 18th and 19th centuries, replicas of the Iron Maiden were built as museum pieces and traveling show attractions. Audiences gasped, newspapers printed illustrations, and writers described it as the perfect emblem of medieval cruelty. Few realized that its story said as much about their own era's fascination with horror as it did about the Middle Ages. Then, in 1987, archaeologist Dr. Henrik Müller led a team excavating the Nuremberg castle dungeons. What they found changed the narrative. The supposed medieval maiden displayed there showed no trace of human remains, no dents, no wear from repeated use. Instead, Müller's team discovered hidden cavities filled with wooden tubing and small bronze bells, mechanisms for sound. It was, he wrote, less an instrument of torture than a stage prop for fear. When asked years later what the discovery meant, Müller said, "The Iron Maiden was never about metal. It was about persuasion. That idea, fear as persuasion, links the Middle Ages to the modern world more than most people realize. In modern interrogation rooms, no iron coffins stand waiting. Yet techniques that echo the same logic persist. Sensory deprivation, prolonged isolation, manipulation of perception, and the suggestion that pain is inevitable if one does not comply." Psychologists studying false confessions have found that exhaustion and fear can make the innocent believe they are guilty. The body remains untouched, the mind turns against itself. This continuity is what makes the story of the Iron Maiden more than a curiosity. It is a mirror held to human history, showing how easily justice can transform into theater. Imagine a prisoner 500 years ago, blindfolded, hearing the creak of metal behind him. Now imagine a suspect in a bright, sterile room today, alone under fluorescent lights, being told that denial will only prolong the process. Both confront the same invisible machinery, the belief that resistance is useless. The Iron Maiden taught inquisitors that imagination is the strongest weapon. They didn't need to draw blood. They needed to control expectation. Once a person believed the worst was inevitable, confession followed naturally. Every replica, every story retold in museums or media perpetuates that lesson. The spikes are only symbols. The real horror lies in how belief itself can be shaped. Historians now place the Iron Maiden among a class of didactic fictions, objects designed to teach moral lessons through fear. Yet its endurance suggests something deeper in the human psyche, a fascination with the boundary between punishment and performance, faith and control. The medieval chroniclers who first described it probably never imagined that 5 centuries later it would become a metaphor in psychology textbooks and legal debates. But the pattern they revealed, how authority uses imagination to compel obedience, has never vanished. In the archives of the University of Heidelberg lies a letter written in 1534 by a minor cleric named Johannes Kaltner, a man whose name would have vanished entirely if not for a single act of conscience. The letter, preserved in browned ink on brittle parchment, is addressed to his superior, Father Matthias von Ulm, an inquisitor responsible for overseeing the refinement of instruments used in the pursuit of repentance. Kaltner's handwriting begins neatly, almost timidly, before growing uneven toward the end. "Reverend Father," he wrote, "I fear we are teaching the people not the mercy of Christ, but the craft of cruelty." He continues, "The instruments we build for repentance may teach cruelty rather than virtue, and in seeking to terrify the sinner, we risk creating only imitators of terror." His warning was not a rebellion, merely hesitation, a flicker of doubt amid centuries of certainty. But even that was too much. The letter ends abruptly, unsigned, and later notes in the same archive indicate that Kaltner was quietly removed from his position for confusion of doctrine. He disappears from all further records. His words, however, endure, carried across centuries as a rare acknowledgement from within the machinery of fear itself. Historians now read them not as an act of defiance, but as a moment of clarity, the recognition that fear, once institutionalized, cannot be contained. Once it becomes policy, it never truly ends. That warning casts a long shadow over what came next. The legend of Margaret Schmidt, the supposed maiden of Nuremberg, survives only through fragments, court summaries, city ledgers, and a single faded woodcut showing a hooded figure before a tall iron shell. Scholars still debate whether she was a real woman or an invention of later chroniclers, a symbol retrofitted into the mythology of the Iron Maiden. Yet her story persists because it captures the moral of its age, how faith could be twisted into architecture, and how belief, once weaponized, could wound as deeply as steel. Margaret's supposed confession, repeated across centuries of retelling, became less about her guilt and more about the hunger for obedience. The inquisitors needed her to confess. The city needed her confession to prove its righteousness. In this way, she became not a person but a narrative, a living demonstration of what happened to those who questioned power. When visitors stand today before the reconstructed Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, safely encased behind museum glass, the air around it carries a strange quiet. The spikes gleam faintly under controlled lighting. Plaques explain that this particular model is likely a 19th-century fabrication, created to satisfy the romantic fascination with medieval cruelty. Yet most visitors, even after reading the disclaimers, whisper the same question. Did they really use it? The answer, as historians now agree, is both yes and no. Perhaps not that exact object, not in that exact way, but the idea it embodied was used countless times. The principle was universal, to make belief itself the instrument of suffering. The device was a symbol, a stage prop for terror, but the techniques it represented, psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, the engineering of confession through expectation, were tragically real. Because once the human mind learns that it can be broken by suggestion alone, no iron is necessary. The most enduring torture is one that convinces the victim to participate in it. In that sense, the Iron Maiden was not a medieval relic, but a prophecy, a foreshadowing of a modern world where fear would become invisible, procedural, bureaucratic. Its true legacy lies not in the rusted steel or the imagined screams of the dungeon, but in the systems that came after. The prisons where lights never dim, the interrogation rooms where silence becomes unbearable, the propaganda that makes compliance feel like morality. Fear evolved, refined into subtler tools, words, orders, data. The Iron Maiden's lesson is the same in every century. Control requires no chains, only belief. Once authority learns to frame obedience as virtue, resistance begins to look like sin. From medieval dungeons to modern interrogation manuals, from whispered accusations to state propaganda, the mechanism remains the same. The walls change shape, the tools become cleaner, the language more civilized, but the structure of fear, the choreography of confession, endures. What was once achieved through spikes and shadow is now accomplished through silence and spectacle. And so, in the end, the Iron Maiden was never merely a device. It was a revelation, a mirror reflecting the human capacity to turn imagination into punishment. It showed that power does not need to draw blood to dominate. It needs only to persuade, to convince the victim that compliance is salvation. That is why, even behind museum glass, even as a reconstructed myth, the Iron Maiden still unsettles those who look at it. It reminds us that cruelty can be learned, sanctified and forgotten, only to reappear in gentler forms. It reminds us that fear, once justified, becomes habit. In that reflection lies the truest horror of all, that obedience can be engineered, and belief, so sacred, so human, can be used to make it feel like choice.